Stargate Book presents The Occult Meaning of Blood by Rudolf Steiner. Audiobook edition and copyright 2025 by Stargate Book. All rights are reserved for this edition. An Esoteric study by Rudolf Steiner, Vienna, 1912. Blood is a very special fluid. Each of you will no doubt know that the title of this lecture is taken from Goethe's Faust. You all know that in this poem we are shown how Faust, the representative of the highest human endeavor, enters into a pact with the powers of evil, which for their part are represented in the poem by Mephistopheles, the emissary of hell. You will also know that Faust must enter into a pact with Mephistopheles, whose deed must be signed with his own blood. Faust at first sees this as a joke. Mephistopheles, however, at this juncture utters the phrase that Goethe no doubt intended to take seriously: blood is a very special fluid. Now, with reference to this verse from Goethe's Faust, we come across a curious trait in Goethe's so-called commentators. You know, of course, how vast the literature dealing with Goethe's version of the Faust legend is. It is a literature of such stupendous dimensions that entire libraries could be filled with it, and I cannot, of course, take the time to expound on the various comments made by these interpreters of Goethe regarding this particular passage. None of the interpretations sheds much more light on the sentence than that given by one of the last commentators, Professor Miner. He, like others, treats it in the light of an ironic remark made by Mephistopheles, and in this connection he makes the following very curious observation, to which I ask you to give your best attention, for no doubt you will be surprised to hear what strange conclusions Goethe's commentators are capable of drawing. Professor Miner observes that the devil is an enemy of blood, and points out that since blood is what sustains and preserves life, the devil, who is the enemy of the human race, must therefore also be the enemy of blood. Then, and rightly so, he draws attention to the fact that even in the oldest versions of the Faust legend, and indeed in legends in general, blood always plays the same part. In an old book on Faust, we are given a detailed description of how Faust makes a slight incision in his left hand with a small penknife, and how then, when he takes up the pen to sign his name on the contract, the blood flowing from the cut forms the words, "O man, flee." All this is authentic enough, but now comes the observation that the devil is the enemy of blood, and that this is the reason why he demands that the signature be written in blood. I would like to ask if you can imagine that a person would be eager to possess the very thing for which he has a dislike. The only reasonable explanation that can be given, not only with regard to Goethe's meaning in this passage, but also with regard to the meaning of the main legend, as well as all the older Faust poems, is that for the devil blood was something special, and that it was not at all indifferent to him whether the deed was signed with ordinary neutral ink or with blood. We can assume nothing more here than that the representative of the powers of evil believes, nay, is convinced, that he will have Faust more especially in his power if only he can get hold of at least a drop of his blood. This is obvious, and no one can really understand the verse otherwise. Faust must inscribe his name in his own blood, not because the devil is inimical to him, but rather because he wishes to gain power over it. Now there is a remarkable perception underlying this passage, namely that he who obtains power over the blood of a man obtains power over man, and that the blood is a very special fluid, because it is the one over which, so to speak, the real struggle must be waged, when it comes to man's struggle between good and evil. All those things that have come down to us in the legends and myths of various nations, and that touch on human life, will in our time undergo a particular transformation with regard to the entire conception and interpretation of human nature. Gone is the time when legends, fairy tales, and myths were considered merely as expressions of a people's childhood imagination. Indeed, the time has also passed when, in a semi-serious and childish manner, it was fashionable to allude to legends as the poetic expression of a nation's soul. Now, this so-called poetic soul of a nation is nothing but the product of the educated bureaucracy. For this type of bureaucracy exists just as much in the official variety. Anyone who has ever observed the soul of a people knows that this is not imaginative fiction or something like that, but something much deeper, and that indeed the legends and fables of the various peoples are expressive of wonderful powers and events. If, from the new vantage point of spiritual inquiry, we meditate on the old legends and myths, allowing those grand and powerful images that have come from primordial times to work on our minds, we will find, if we have been equipped for the task by the methods of occult science, that these legends and myths are the expressions of a deeper and more ancient wisdom. It is true that at first we might be inclined to ask why, in a primitive state of development and with primitive ideas, unsophisticated man was able to pictorially present to himself the enigmas of the universe in these legends and fables, and why, when we meditate on them now, we see in them in pictorial form what today's occult investigation is revealing to us with greater clarity. This is a subject that is bound to cause surprise at first. Yet those who probe deeper and deeper into the ways and means by which these fables and myths came into being will find every trace of surprise vanish, every doubt pass away. Indeed, they will find in these legends not only what one calls a naive and unsophisticated view of things, but the wonderfully profound and wise expression of a primordial and true conception of the world. Much more can be learned by thoroughly examining the foundations of these myths and legends than by absorbing the intellectual and experimental science of the present. But for such work, the student must naturally be familiar with those methods of investigation that belong to spiritual science. Now, all that is contained in these legends and in these ancient worldviews about blood is important, for in those ancient times there was a wisdom by which man understood the true and far-reaching significance of blood, this very special fluid that is itself the flowing life of human beings. We cannot today enter into the question of the origin of this wisdom of ancient times, although some indication of this will be given at the end of this lecture. The actual study of this subject must, however, remain pending to be dealt with in future lectures. Blood itself, its importance to man, and the part it plays in the progress of human civilization will occupy our attention today. We will consider it neither from a physiological nor from a purely scientific point of view, but rather from the point of view of a spiritual conception of the universe. We will better approach our subject if, to begin with, we understand the meaning of an ancient maxim, one of which is intimately linked to the civilization of ancient Egypt, where the priestly wisdom of Hermes flourished. It is an axiom that forms the fundamental principle of all spiritual science and has become known as the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. You will find that there are many amateurish interpretations of this sentence. The explanation, however, that must occupy us today is as follows. It is clear to spiritual science that the world to which man has primary access by means of his five senses does not represent the whole world, which is in reality only the expression of a deeper world hidden behind it, namely, the spiritual world. Now, this spiritual world is called, according to the Hermetic axiom, the upper world, the world above, and the world of the senses that shows itself around us, whose existence we know by means of our senses, and which we are able to study by means of our intellect, is the lower world, the world below, the expression of that higher, spiritual world. Thus the occultist, looking at this world of the senses, sees in it nothing definitive, but rather a kind of physiognomy that he recognizes as the expression of a world of the soul and spirit. Just as, when looking at a human face, one must not stop at the shape of the face and the gestures, paying attention only to them, but must naturally move on from the physiognomy and the gestures to the spiritual element that is expressed in them. What every person does instinctively in regard to any being endowed with a soul is what the occultist, or spiritual scientist, does in regard to the whole world. and as above, so below would be explained thus, referring to man. Every impulse that animates his soul is expressed in his face. A hard, coarse face expresses the roughness of the soul. A smile tells of inner joy. A tear betrays a suffering soul. I will apply the Hermetic axiom here to the question: what actually constitutes wisdom? Spiritual science has always maintained that human wisdom has something to do with experience, and that experience is painful. He who is actually in the grip of suffering manifests in this suffering something that is a lack of inner harmony. He, on the other hand, who has overcome pain and suffering and bears the fruits of it within himself, will always tell you that through suffering he has acquired a certain measure of wisdom. The joys and pleasures of life, all that life can offer me in terms of satisfaction, all these things I receive with gratitude. Yet I am much more reluctant to part with my past pain and suffering than with those pleasant gifts of life, for it is to my pain and suffering that I owe my wisdom. And so it is that in wisdom, occult science has always recognized what can be called crystallized pain, pain that has been conquered and thus changed into its opposite. Interestingly, more materialistic modern research has recently come to exactly the same conclusion. A book was recently published on the mimicry of thought, a book well worth reading. It is not the work of a theosophist, but of a student of nature and the human soul. The author strives to show how man's inner life, his way of thinking, as it were, imprints itself on his physiognomy. The student of human nature draws attention to the fact that there is always something in the expression on a thinker's face that is suggestive of what could be described as absorbed pain. Thus, you will see this principle come to light again in the most materialistic view of our times, a brilliant confirmation of that immemorial axiom of spiritual science. You will become more and more deeply aware of it, and you will find that little by little, point by point, the ancient wisdom will reappear in the science of modern times. Occult inquiry definitely shows that all things that surround us in this world, the mineral foundation, the plant covering, and the animal world, must be regarded as the physiognomic expression, or the below, of a above or spiritual life that lies behind them. From the point of view of occultism, the things that are presented to us in the world of the senses can only be rightly understood if our knowledge includes cognition of the above, the spiritual archetype, the original spiritual beings from which all manifested things originated. For this reason, today we will devote ourselves to the study of what lies behind the phenomenon of the blood, what has formed in the blood its physiognomic expression in the world of the senses. When you have understood this spiritual background of the blood, you will realize how knowledge of such matters is bound to affect our entire mental outlook on life. Matters of great importance press upon us these days, matters that affect the education, not only of young people, but of entire nations. And furthermore, we are faced with the important educational question that humanity will have to face in the future, and which cannot fail to be recognized by all those who notice the great social upheavals of our time, and the claims that are being made everywhere, whether they are incorporated in the question of women, work, or peace. All these things preoccupy our anxious minds. But all these questions become illuminated as soon as we recognize the nature of the spiritual essence that lies at the bottom of our blood. Who can deny that this question is closely related to the question of race, which is coming to the fore at the moment? But the question of race is one that we can never understand until we understand the mysteries of blood and the results of mixing the blood of different races. Finally, there is yet another issue, the importance of which becomes more and more acute as we strive to free ourselves from the hitherto aimless methods of dealing with it and try to address it in its fullest aspects. This problem is that of colonization, which arises wherever civilized races come into contact with uncivilized ones. That is to say, to what extent are uncivilized peoples capable of becoming civilized? How can a completely barbaric nigger or savage become civilized? And how should we deal with them? And here we must consider not only the feelings due to a vague morality, but we are also faced with the great, serious, and vital problems of the very fact of existence. Those who are not aware of the conditions that govern a people, whether they are at the top or the bottom of their evolution, and whether one or the other is a question of their blood, people like these will hardly be able to find the right way to introduce civilization to an alien race. These are all questions that arise as soon as the question of blood is touched upon. What blood itself is, presumably you all know from the current teachings of natural science, and you will be aware that, as far as humans and higher animals are concerned, this blood is practically fluid life. You know that it is through the blood that the inner man comes into contact with that which is external, and that in the course of this process, the blood of man absorbs oxygen, which constitutes the true breath of life. Through the absorption of this oxygen, the blood undergoes a renewal. Oxygen in streaming blood is a kind of poison to the organism, a destroyer and breaker of sorts. But through the absorption of oxygen, the blue-red blood is transmuted by a combustion process into a red, life-giving fluid. This blood, which makes its way into all parts of the body, depositing its nourishing particles everywhere, has the task of directly assimilating the materials of the external world and applying them, by the shortest possible method, to the nourishment of the body. It is necessary for man and the higher animals to first absorb such foodstuffs into their blood, to absorb oxygen from the air into it, and to build and maintain the body by means of it. One with knowledge of souls has observed not without truth. The blood with its circulation is like a second being, and in relation to the man of bones, muscles, and nerves, acts as a kind of external world. In fact, the entire human being constantly draws its sustenance from the blood, and at the same time discharges into it what it does not need. A man's blood is thus a true double that always keeps him company, from which he draws new strength, and to which he gives everything he can no longer use. Man's liquid life is therefore a good name to give to blood, for this ever-changing special fluid is surely as important to man as cellulose is to lower organisms. The distinguished scientist Ernst Haeckel, who probed deeply into the workings of nature, rightly drew attention in many of his popular works to the fact that blood is actually the last factor to originate in an organism. If we follow the development of the human embryo, we find that the rudiments of bones and muscles evolve long before the first tendency to form blood becomes evident. The basis for the formation of the blood, with all its systems of blood vessels, appears very late in the development of the embryo, and from this natural science has rightly concluded that the formation of the blood occurred late in the evolution of the universe, that other powers that were there had to be raised to the height of the blood, so to speak, in order to realize at that height what had to be accomplished inwardly in the human being. It is not until the human embryo has repeated within itself all the previous stages of human growth, thus reaching the condition in which the world was before the formation of the blood, that it is ready to perform this crowning act of evolution, the transmutation and elevation of all that had gone before into the very special fluid we call blood. If we wish to study those mysterious laws of the spiritual universe that exist behind the blood, we must deal a little with some of the most elementary concepts of theosophy. These have often been expounded, and you will see that these elementary ideas of theosophy are the above, and that this above is expressed in the important laws that govern the blood, as well as the rest of life, as in a physiognomy. Those present who are already familiar with the primary laws of theosophy will, I hope, allow a brief repetition of them for the benefit of those who are here for the first time. Indeed, such repetition may serve to make these laws clearer and clearer to the former, thus hearing them applied to new and special cases. To those who know nothing about theosophy, who have not yet familiarized themselves with these conceptions of life and the universe, what I am about to say may seem little more than a lot of words put together that they can do nothing about. But the fault does not always lie in the lack of an idea behind the words, when they convey nothing to a person. Indeed, we can adopt here, with a slight modification, an observation by the witty Lichtenberg, who said, "If a head and a book collide, and the resulting sound is hollow, the book is not necessarily to blame." And so it is with our contemporaries when they pass judgment on theosophical truths. If these truths sound to the ears of many like mere words, words to which they cannot attach any meaning, the fault does not necessarily lie with theosophy. Those who have found their way into these matters will know that behind all the allusions to higher beings, such beings really do exist, even if they are not to be found in the world of the senses. Our theosophical conception of the universe shows us that man, as far as he reveals himself to our senses in the external world, as far as his form is concerned, is but one part of the complete human being, and that in fact behind the physical body there are many other parts. Man possesses this physical body in common with all the so-called lifeless mineral objects around him. In addition to this, however, man possesses the etheric body, or vital body. The term etheric is not used here in the same sense as when applied by physical science. This etheric or vital body, as it is sometimes called, far from being a figment of the imagination, is as distinctly visible to the developed spiritual senses of the occultist as are colors perceptible externally to the physical eye. This etheric body can actually be seen by the clairvoyant. It is the principle that calls inorganic materials to life, that, drawing them from their inanimate condition, weaves them into the thread of the garment of life. Do not imagine that this body is for the occultist merely something that he adds by thought to that which is lifeless. This is what natural scientists try to do. They try to complete what they see with the microscope by inventing something they call the life principle. Now, such a viewpoint is not taken from theosophical research. This has a fixed principle. It does not say, "Here I stand as a researcher, as I am. Everything in the world must conform to my present point of view. What I am not able to perceive has no existence." This kind of argument makes as much sense as if a blind man were to say that colors are simply a matter of imagination. The man who knows nothing about a matter is in no position to judge it, but rather the one into whose range of experience such matters may have entered. Now man is in a state of evolution, and for this reason theosophy says, if you remain as you are, you will not see the etheric body, and you can therefore speak of the boundaries of knowledge and ignorabimus. But if you develop and acquire the faculties necessary for the knowledge of spiritual things, you will no longer speak of the boundaries of knowledge, because these only exist until man has developed his inner senses. It is for this reason that agnosticism constitutes such a heavy brake on our civilization. For it says, man is so-and-so, and being so-and-so can only know this and that. To such a doctrine we reply, even if he is so-and-so today, he must become different, and when he is different, he will know something else. Thus, the second part of man is the etheric body, which he has in common with the plant kingdom. The third part is the so-called astral body, a meaningful and beautiful name, the reason for which will be explained later. Theosophists who wish to change this name can have no idea of what is implied in it. The astral body is assigned the task, in man and animal, of raising the vital substance to the plane of feeling, so that in the vital substance not only fluids can move, but also that in it all that is known as pain and pleasure, joy and sorrow, can be expressed. And here we immediately have the essential difference between the plant and the animal, although there are some transitional states between these two. A recent school of naturalists is of the opinion that feeling, in its literal sense, should also be ascribed to plants. This, however, is no more than a play on words. For although it is obvious that certain plants are of such a sensitive organization that they respond to particular things that can be approached, yet such a condition cannot be described as feeling. For feeling to exist, an image must form in the being as a reflection of what produces the sensation. If, therefore, certain plants respond to an external stimulus, this is not proof that the plant responds to the stimulus with a feeling, i.e., that it experiences it inwardly. That which experiences it inwardly has its seat in the astral body, and so we come to see that that which has attained the animal condition is composed of the physical body, the etheric or vital body, and the astral body. Man, however, rises above the animal by the possession of something quite distinct, and thoughtful men have always known what this superiority consists of. It is indicated in what Jean-Paul says about himself in his autobiography. He recounts that he remembers very well the day when, as a child, in the courtyard of his parents' house, the thought suddenly flashed through his mind that he was an I, a being capable of inwardly saying I to himself, and he tells us that this made a deep impression on him. All the so-called external science of the soul overlooks the most important point that is involved here. I will therefore ask you to follow me for a few moments in making an analysis of what is a very subtle subject, but which will show you how things stand. In all human discourse, there is one small word that differs from all others. Each of you can name the things around you. Each of you can call a table and a chair a chair. But there is one word, one name, that you cannot apply to anything but the person who possesses it, and that is the little word I. No one can address another as I. This I must resonate from the innermost soul. It is the name that only the soul itself can apply to itself. Every other person is a you to me, and I am a you to him. All religions have recognized this I as the expression of that principle in the soul through which its innermost being, its divine nature, can speak. Here, then, begins that which can never penetrate through the external senses, which can never, in its true meaning, be named from without, but which must resonate from the innermost being. Here begins that monologue, that soliloquy of the soul, by which the divine self makes its presence known when the way is clear for the coming of the spirit into the human soul. In the religions of earlier civilizations, among the ancient Hebrews, for example, this name was known as the unpronounceable name of God, and whatever interpretation modern philology may choose to give it, the ancient Hebrew name of God has no other meaning than that expressed by our word I. A shudder passed through those present when the name of the unknown God was pronounced by the initiates, when they faintly perceived what those words that reverberated in the temple meant, I am what I am. In this word is expressed a fourth principle of human nature, that which only man possesses while on earth. And this I in turn contains and develops within itself the germs of the higher stages of humanity. We can only take a glimpse of what will evolve through this fourth principle in the future. We must emphasize that man consists of a physical body, an etheric body, an astral body, and the ego, or true inner self, and that within this inner self lie the rudiments of three further stages of development which will originate in the blood. These are manas, budhi, and atma. Manas, the spirit self, as distinct from the corporeal self. Budhi, the life spirit. Atma, the actual and true spirit man, a distant ideal for today's man. The rudimentary germ now latent within, but destined in future ages to reach perfection. We have 7 colors in the rainbow, 7 tones in the scale, 7 sets of atomic weights, and 7 degrees in the scale of the human being. And these again are divided into 4 lower and 3 higher degrees. We shall now try to understand clearly how this higher spiritual triad secures a physiognomic expression in the lower quaternary, and how it appears to us in the world of the senses. Let us take, firstly, that which has crystallized into form as the physical body of man. This has in common with all so-called lifeless nature. When we speak theosophically of the physical body, we do not even mean what the eye sees, but rather that combination of forces that has constructed the physical body, that living force that exists behind the visible form. Let us now look at a plant. This is a being that possesses an etheric body, which elevates the physical substance to life. That is, it converts it into living sap. What is it that converts the so-called lifeless forces into the living sap? We call it the etheric body, and the etheric body does exactly the same work in animals and in men. It causes that which has a merely material existence to become a living configuration, a living form. This etheric body is, in turn, permeated by an astral body. And what does the astral body do? It causes the substance that has been set in motion to experience inwardly the circulation of those fluids moving outwards, so that the outer movement is reflected in the inner experience. We have now reached the point where we are able to understand man in terms of his place in the animal kingdom. All the substances of which man is composed, such as oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, etc., are now in the animal kingdom. If what enters the etheric body transformed into living substance must have inner experiences, if it is to create inner reflections of what takes place externally, then the etheric body must be permeated by what we have known as the astral body, for it is the astral body that gives rise to sensation. But at this stage, the astral body only calls forth sensation in a particular way. The etheric body transforms inorganic substances into vital fluids, and the astral body in turn transforms this vital substance into sentient substance. But, and this I ask you especially to notice, what is it that a being who has no more than these three bodies is capable of feeling? It feels only itself, its own vital processes. It leads a life confined within itself. Now, this is an extraordinary fact and of extraordinary importance for us to bear in mind. If you look at one of the lower animals, what do you find that he has accomplished? It has transformed inanimate substance into living substance, and living substance into sensible substance. And sensible substance is only found where the rudiments of what at a later stage appears as a developed nervous system exist. Thus we have inanimate substance, living substance, and substance permeated by nerves capable of sensation. If you look at a crystal, you must recognize it primarily as the expression of certain natural laws that prevail in the outer world in the so-called inanimate realm. No crystal could be formed without the assistance of all surrounding nature. No single link can be detached from the chain of the cosmos and set aside by life itself. And equally little can be separated from his environment by man, who, if he were raised to a height of even a few miles above the earth, must inevitably die. Just as man is only conceivable in the place where he is, where the necessary forces combine in him, so it is also with regard to the crystal, and therefore he who sees a crystal well will see in it an image of the whole of nature, indeed of the whole cosmos. What Cuvier said is indeed the case, namely, that a competent anatomist will be able to tell to which type of animal a given bone belonged, each animal having its own particular type of bone formation. Thus, the entire cosmos lives in the form of a crystal. In the same way, the whole cosmos expresses itself in the living substance of a single being. The fluids flowing in a being are, at the same time, a small world and a counterpart of the big world. And when substance has become capable of sensation, what then dwells in the sensations of the most elemental creatures? Such sensations reflect cosmic laws, so that each individual living creature perceives within itself microcosmically the entire macrocosm. The sentient life of an elemental creature is this an image of the life of the universe, just as crystal is an image of its form. The consciousness of such living creatures is, of course, only vague. Yet this very vagueness of consciousness is counterbalanced by its much greater scope, for the entire cosmos is felt in the dim consciousness of an elemental being. Now, in man, there is only a more complicated structure than the same three bodies found in the simplest sensible living being. Take man, without considering his blood. Take him as a being made up of the substance of the surrounding physical world and containing, like the plant, certain juices that transform it into living substance and in which a nervous system is gradually organized. This first nervous system is the so-called sympathetic system, and in the case of man it extends the whole length of the spinal column, to which it is attached by small wires on either side. It also has at each end a series of nodes, from which wires branch off to different parts, such as the lungs, digestive organs, and so on. This sympathetic nervous system gives rise, in the first instance, to the life of sensation just described. But man's consciousness does not extend deep enough to allow him to follow the cosmic processes mirrored by these nerves. They are a means of expression, and just as human life is formed by the surrounding cosmic world, so this cosmic world is reflected back into the sympathetic nervous system. These nerves live a dim inner life, and if man were able to immerse himself in his sympathetic system and put his higher nervous system to sleep, he would see, as in a state of luminous life, the silent workings of the powerful cosmic laws. In earlier times, men possessed a clairvoyant faculty that is now superseded, but which can be experienced when, by special processes, the activity of the higher nervous system is suspended, thus releasing the lower or subliminal consciousness. At such times, man lives in that nervous system which, in its own special way, is a reflection of the world around him. Certain lower animals still retain this state of consciousness, and although dim and indistinct, it is essentially broader than the consciousness of today's man. A world that extends widely is reflected as a dim inner life, not just a small section as perceived by contemporary man. But in the case of man, something else also happened. When evolution got to the point where the sympathetic nervous system was developed, so that the cosmos was reflected in it, the evolving being at this point opened up to the outside world again. The spinal cord was added to the sympathetic system. The brain and spinal cord system then leads to those organs through which the connection to the outside world is established. Man, having progressed so far, is no longer called upon to act only as a mirror to reflect the primordial laws of cosmic evolution, but a relationship is established between the reflection itself and the external world. The conjunction of the sympathetic system and the higher nervous system is expressive of the change that has previously taken place in the astral body. The latter no longer merely lives in cosmic life in a state of dull consciousness, but adds its own special inner existence to it. The sympathetic system enables the being to perceive that which takes place outside. The higher nervous system enables him to perceive that which takes place within. And the higher form of the nervous system, such as is possessed by man in general at the present stage of evolution, takes from the more highly developed astral body the material for the creation of images or representations of the external world. Man has lost the power of perceiving the old primitive images of the outer world, but on the other hand, he is now conscious of his inner life, and from this inner life he forms, at a higher stage, a new world of images in which, it is true, only a small part of the outer world is reflected, but more clearly and more perfectly than before. Hand in hand with this transformation comes another change in the higher stages of development. The transformation thus begun extends from the astral body to the etheric body. Just as the etheric body in the process of its transformation evolves the astral body, just as the sympathetic nervous system is joined by the brain and spinal system, so too that which, after receiving the lower circulation of fluids, has grown and freed itself from the etheric body, now transmutes these lower fluids into what we know as blood. The blood is thus an expression of the individualized etheric body, just as the brain and spinal cord are an expression of the individualized astral body. And it is this individualization that leads to that which lives as ego or I. Having followed man so far in his evolution, we find that we are dealing with a chain of 5 links, which concern the physical body, the etheric body, and the astral body. These links are inorganic, neutral, physical forces, vital fluids which are also found in plants, the inferior or sympathetic nervous system, the upper astral body which evolved from the lower astral body, finds its expression in the spinal cord and brain, the principle that identifies the etheric body. Just as these last 2 principles have been individualized, so too the first principle through which lifeless matter enters the human body, serving to build it, will be individualized. But in our present humanity, we find only the first rudiments of this transformation. We have seen how external formless substances enter the human body and how the etheric body transforms these materials into living forms. How, moreover, the astral body fabricates images of the external world, and how this reflection of the external world resolves itself into inner experiences, and how this inner life then reproduces images of the external world from itself. Now, when this metamorphosis extends to the etheric body, blood is formed. The blood vessels, together with the heart, are the expression of the transformed etheric body, in the same way that the spinal cord and the brain express the transformed astral body. Just as by means of the brain the outer world is experienced inwardly, so also by means of the blood, this inner world is transformed into an outer expression in the body of man. I shall have to speak in similitudes to describe to you the complicated processes that must now be considered. The blood absorbs the images of the outside world that the brain has formed within, transforms them into living constructive forces, and builds the actual human body with them. The blood is thus the material that builds the human body. We have before us a process in which the blood extracts from its cosmic environment the highest substance it can obtain, namely oxygen, which renews the blood and supplies it with new life. In this way, our blood opens up to the outside world. We have thus traveled the path from the outer world to the inner world, and again from that inner world to the outer world. 2 things are now possible. We see that the blood originates when man confronts the outer world as an independent being, when from the perceptions to which the outer world has given rise, he in turn produces different forms and images of his own, thus becoming creative himself, and making possible the birth of the I, the individual will. A being who had not yet taken place in this process could not say I. In the blood is found the principle for the development of the I. The I can only be expressed when a being is able to form within itself the images it has obtained from the outside world. An I being must be able to take the external world into itself and reproduce it inwardly. If man were only endowed with a brain, he would only be able to reproduce images of the external world within himself and experience them within himself. Then he could only say, "The external world is reflected in me as in a mirror." If, however, it is able to construct a new form for this reflection of the external world, this form is no longer just the reflected external world, it is I. A being with a sympathetic nervous system only reflects the world around him. He does not perceive that external world as himself, as his inner life. A being that possesses a spinal cord and a brain perceives the reflection as its inner life. But when a being possesses blood, he experiences his inner life as his own form. Through the blood, assisted by oxygen from the external world, the individual body is formed according to the images of the inner life. This formation is expressed as the perception of the self. The ego turns in 2 directions, and the blood expresses this outwardly. The visions of the ego are directed inwards. They build the inner man, and again they are directed outwards towards the oxygen of the outer world. That is why, when he falls asleep, man sinks into unconsciousness. He sinks into what his consciousness can experience in the blood. When, however, he opens his eyes again to the outside world, the blood adds to its constructive forces the images produced by the brain and the senses. Thus the blood stands halfway, so to speak, between the inner world of images and the outer living world of form. This role becomes clear to us when we study two phenomena, namely ancestry, the relationship between conscious beings, and experience in the external world of events. Ancestry, or descent, places us where we are according to the law of the blood bond. A person is born from a bond, a race, a tribe, a line of ancestors, and what these ancestors bequeathed to him is expressed in his blood. In the blood is gathered, so to speak, all that the material past has built up in man, and in the blood is also formed all that is prepared for the future. When, therefore, man temporarily suppresses his higher consciousness, when he is in a state of hypnotism or of somnambulism, or when he is atavistically clairvoyant, he descends into a much deeper consciousness, in which he becomes dreamily aware of the great cosmic laws, but nevertheless perceives them much more clearly than the more vivid dreams of ordinary sleep. At such times the activity of his brain is suspended, and during the deepest states of somnambulism, this also applies to the spinal cord. Man experiences the activities of his sympathetic nervous system. That is, in a dim and hazy way, he perceives the life of the entire cosmos. In these moments, the blood no longer expresses the images of the inner life that are produced by the brain, but presents those that the outer world has formed in it. Now, however, we must bear in mind that the forces of his ancestors have helped to make him what he is. Just as he inherits the shape of his nose from an ancestor, so he inherits the shape of his whole body. In such moments of suppressed consciousness, he feels his ancestors within him, just as during his waking consciousness he feels the images of the outside world. That is to say, his ancestors are active in his blood, and in such moments he faintly participates in their remote life. Everything in the world is in a state of evolution, including human consciousness. Man has not always had the consciousness he now possesses. When we go back to the time of our earliest ancestors, we find a different kind of consciousness. Presently, man in his waking life perceives external things through the agency of his senses and forms ideas about them. These ideas about the external world work in his blood. Everything he has received as a result of sense experience lives and is active in his blood. His memory is stored with these sense experiences. On the other hand, today's man is no longer aware of what he possesses in his inner bodily life by inheritance from his ancestors. He knows nothing of the forms of his internal organs, but in former times it was different. Then he lived in the blood, not only what the senses had received from the external world, but also what is contained in the bodily form. And because that bodily form had been inherited from his ancestors, man perceived their life within himself. If we think of a heightened form of this consciousness, we will have an idea of how it is also expressed in a corresponding form of memory. A person who only experiences what he perceives with his senses remembers nothing but the events connected with those outer sensory experiences. He can only be aware of those things that he may have experienced in this way since his childhood. But for prehistoric man, the case was different. Such a man perceived what was within him, and since this inner experience was the result of heredity, he passed through the experiences of his ancestors by means of his inner faculty. He remembered not only his own childhood, but also the experiences of his ancestors. This life of his ancestors was, in fact, always present in the images his blood received, because, incredible as it may seem to the materialistic ideas of the present day, there was once a form of consciousness by means of which men regarded not only their own sensory perceptions as their own experiences, but also the experiences of their ancestors. In those days, when they said, "I experienced this or that thing," they were alluding not only to what had happened to them personally, but also to the experiences of their ancestors, because they could remember them. This earlier consciousness was, it is true, of a very tenuous, very nebulous type compared to the waking consciousness of man today. It had more the nature of a vivid dream, but on the other hand, it embraced much more of our present-day consciousness. The son felt connected to his father and grandfather as an I because he felt their experiences as if they were his own. And because man possessed this consciousness, because he lived not only in his personal world, but because the consciousness of previous generations also resided within him. In giving his name, he included in that name all that belonged to his ancestral line, father, son, grandson, etc., designated with a name that which was common to all of them, that which passed through them all. In short, a person simply felt like a member of an entire line of descent. This feeling was real and true. We must now ask how the change in this form of consciousness came about. This occurred because of a cause well known to occult history. If you go back into the past, you will find that there is a particular moment that stands out in the history of every nation. It is the moment when a people enters a new phase of civilization, the moment when it ceases to have old traditions, when it ceases to possess its ancient wisdom, the wisdom that was passed down through the generations by blood. The nation possesses, however, a consciousness of it, and this is expressed in its legends. In times past, tribes kept away from each other, and individual members of families intermarried. You will find that this has been the case with all races and peoples, and it was an important moment for humanity when this principle was broken, when foreign blood was introduced, and when marriage between relatives was replaced by marriage with strangers, when endogamy gave way to exogamy. Endogamy preserves the blood of the generation. It allows the same blood to flow in separate members as flows for generations throughout the tribe or nation. Exogamy inoculates man with new blood, and this breaking of the tribal principle, this mingling of blood, which sooner or later takes place among all peoples, signifies the birth of the external understanding, the birth of the intellect. The important thing to bear in mind here is that in ancient times there was a vague clairvoyance from which myths and legends originated. This clairvoyance could exist in the almost related blood, just as our current consciousness arises from the mixing of blood. The birth of logical thought, the birth of the intellect, was simultaneous with the advent of exogamy. Surprising as this may seem, it is nevertheless true. It is a fact that will be increasingly proven by external investigation. Indeed, the first steps along this line have already been taken. But this mixing of blood that takes place through exogamy is also that which at the same time obliterates the clairvoyance of earlier days, so that humanity can evolve to a higher stage of development. And just as the person who has passed through the stages of occult development regains this clairvoyance and transmutes it into a new form, so our masturbatory consciousness of today has evolved from the dim and vague clairvoyance that was obtained in ancient times. At present, everything in a man's environment is imprinted in his blood. Thus, the environment shapes the inner man in accordance with the outer world. In the case of primitive man, it was what was contained in the body that was most fully expressed in the blood. In those early times, the memory of ancestral experiences was inherited, and along with this, good or bad tendencies. In the blood of the descendants, the effects of the ancestors' tendencies were to be traced. Now, when the blood was mixed through exogamy, this close connection with the ancestors was broken, and man began to live his own life. He began to adjust his moral tendencies according to what he experienced in his personal life, and in a mixed blood the power of personal experience. Myths and legends tell these things. They say, "What has power over your blood has power over you." This traditional power ceased when it could no longer act on the blood, because the latter's ability to respond to that power was extinguished by the mixing of foreign blood. This statement is valid to the widest extent. Whatever power wants to gain dominion over a man, this power must work on him in such a way that the work is expressed in his blood. If, therefore, an evil power wants to influence a man, it must be able to influence his blood. This is the profound and spiritual meaning of the Faust quotation. That is why the representative of the evil principle says, "Sign your name to the covenant with your blood. If once I have your name written in your blood, then I can hold you in my grip with that which most makes a man waver. Then I will have drawn you to me. For he who has dominion over the blood is master of man himself, or man's self." When two groups of people come into contact, as in the case of colonization, those who know the conditions of evolution are able to predict whether an alien form of civilization can be assimilated by the others. Take, for example, a people that is a product of its environment, in whose blood this environment has been built, and try to graft a new form of civilization onto that people. This is impossible. That is the reason why certain Aboriginal peoples had to sink as soon as the colonizers arrived in their particular parts of the world. It is from this point of view that the issue will have to be considered, and the idea that changes can be imposed on all and sundry will in time cease to be supported, because it is pointless to ask more of the blood than it can bear. Modern science has discovered that if the blood of one animal is mixed with that of another unrelated, the blood of one is fatal to that of the other. This has been known in occultism for centuries. If the blood of human beings is mixed with that of the lower apes, the result is destructive to the species, for the one is too far removed from the other. If, again, one mixes the blood of humans with that of the higher apes, death does not ensure. Just as this mixing of the blood of different species of animals leads to actual death when the types are too far apart, so too the ancient clairvoyance of undeveloped man was killed when his blood was mixed with that of others who did not belong to the same stock. The whole of today's intellectual life is the result of the mixing of blood, and the time is not far off when the influence this had on human life will be studied, and can be traced back in the history of mankind when investigations are again conducted from this point of view. We have seen that blood united with blood in the case of distantly related animal species kills. Blood united with blood in the case of more closely related animal species does not kill. The physical organism of man survives when strange blood comes in contact with strange blood, but the clairvoyant power perishes under the influence of this mixture of blood, or exogamy. Man is so constituted that when blood mixes with blood not too far back in evolution, intellect is born. In this way, the original clairvoyance that belonged to the lower animal man was destroyed, and a new form of consciousness took its place. Thus, in the higher stages of human development, we find something similar to what happens in a lower stage in the animal kingdom. In the latter, strange blood kills strange blood. In the human kingdom, the strange blood kills that which is intimately related to the kindred blood, namely, the dim, dreamy clairvoyance. Our everyday objective consciousness is therefore the result of a destructive process. In the course of evolution, the type of mental life due to endogamy was destroyed, but in its place, exogamy gave birth to the intellect, the awakened consciousness of today. That which can live in man's blood is that which lives in his ego. Just as the physical body is the expression of the physical principle, just as the etheric body is the expression of the vital fluids and their systems, and the astral body of the nervous system, so the blood is the expression of the ego. Physical principle, etheric body, and astral body are the above. Physical body, vital system, and nervous system are the below. Similarly, the ego is the above, and the blood is the below. Whoever therefore wants to dominate a man must first dominate that man's blood. This must be borne in mind if any progress is to be made in practical life. For example, the individuality of a people can be destroyed if, when colonizing them, one demands more from their blood than they can bear, because in the blood the ego is expressed. Beauty and truth possess a man only when they possess his blood. Mephistopheles obtains possession of Faust's blood because he wishes to dominate his ego. So we can say that the sentence that formed the theme of this lecture was drawn from deep depths of knowledge. For truly, blood is a very special fluid. The Occult Meaning of Blood by Rudolf Steiner was presented by Stargate Book. Sound recording copyright 2025 and produced by Stargate Book 2025. All rights are reserved.